We don't bring people like you to places like that, Maggie. You'd only embarrass us. That's what Vanessa said to me 3 months ago, with her lipstick barely dry. So imagine her face the night I walked into that same restaurant, set a folder down on the white tablecloth between her and my son, and watched every drop of color drain out of her cheeks. Sit down, both of you, I told them. You wanted me to stay home so I wouldn't embarrass anybody. Fine. But now you're going to sit here, and you're going to look at what I found. My son couldn't even lift his eyes off that folder. My daughter-in-law's wine glass stopped halfway to her mouth, and me for the first time in years. My hands weren't shaking. My name is Margaret Cole. Everybody calls me Maggie. I'm 65 years old, and I've spent 40 of those years with a needle in my hand, letting out seams and taking in waistlines, and hemming other people's good clothes so my son could grow up in his own. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments. And please, stay with me until the end. Because what happened between that dinner table and this folder is the whole reason I'm still standing. Let me take you back to how it started. 3 months ago, a Friday night. I remember I was standing in the front room of my own house, with an apron still tied around my waist, straight pins tucked into the fabric at my chest the way I've carried them my whole working life. I'd been up since 5 that morning, and not for myself. I'd been finishing the alterations on the dress Vanessa was going to wear that night. A deep burgundy thing, expensive. Italian, the kind of dress that costs more than I clear in a month. She'd brought it to me 2 days before and told me the waist gaped and the hem dragged. And could I fix it? And could I do it fast? Because it was important. So I did. I took it in at the sides by hand, invisible stitches, the kind nobody sees but everybody feels. I pressed it. I hung it on the good hanger. And that night, she stood in front of my hallway mirror, wearing my work on her body, and told me I wasn't good enough to sit in the same room as her. Daniel was next to her. My Daniel, 38 years old, adjusting his tie in the reflection. He looked handsome. He always did. He got that from his father. Wherever that man ran off to all those years ago, Daniel didn't look at me. That was the part that got me. He just kept fussing with that tie like the knot was the most important thing in the world, like his mother wasn't standing 4 feet behind him with her heart cracking down the middle. It was supposed to be a family dinner. That's what he'd told me 2 weeks earlier. A big celebration, the whole family, to mark Vanessa's boutique hitting some milestone. I'd been so happy about it I could hardly sleep. I'd already picked out what I was going to wear. My navy dress, the one I save for weddings and funerals, and the 2 or 3 good nights a year that fall somewhere in between. I'd been looking forward to it the way a child looks forward to Christmas. Turns out I was never on the guest list. I was just the woman who handed over the money when Daniel came asking 3 months before that, and the seamstress who fixed the dress. Nothing more. Vanessa turned around from the mirror and looked me up and down, slow, the way you'd look at a stain on a sofa you're deciding whether to throw out. Maggie, honey, she said, and she always said honey like it was an insult. This is one of the nicest restaurants in the city. There's a dress code. There's a certain kind of crowd. You understand. I didn't understand. I stood there and I said, I have my navy dress. I can be ready in 10 minutes. She let out a little laugh through her nose. It's not about the dress, she said. It's about, how do I put this? It's about knowing how to carry yourself. Which fork? What to say? Who to say it to? These are important people, Maggie. Business people. We can't have any, you know. Surprises. Surprises. That's what I was to them. A surprise you had to head off before it embarrassed you in public. I looked at my son. Daniel, I said, and I hated how small my voice came out, thin and soft like a girl asking permission. Daniel, you told me we were all going. You said it was for family. He finally sighed, a big put-upon sigh, like I was a bill he'd forgotten to pay. Mom, we talked about this, he said. We didn't talk about anything. We had never talked about it, but that's how he does it. He says we already discussed this, so that you start doubting your own memory, so that you feel like the difficult one for being hurt. The place is real formal, he went on. You wouldn't be comfortable. We're doing you a favor, honestly. A favor. Leaving me home alone was a favor. That money, though, I said, and I don't know where I found the nerve. The 3,000 you asked me for, Daniel. That was for tonight, wasn't it? That was for this dinner. And here's the thing I'll never forget. He looked at me then. He actually looked at me for the first time all night. And there was something uncomfortable in his eyes, a flicker of it. But underneath the uncomfortable, there was something worse. There was nothing, just nothing. Yeah, Mom, he said, and we appreciate it. That's exactly why we're telling you now, ahead of time. So you don't go getting all dressed up for nothing. So I don't get all dressed up for nothing. As if sparing me the trouble of putting on my good dress was the kindness of the century. Vanessa stepped in close then, close enough that I could smell her perfume. And I need you to understand something. That perfume was the bottle I bought her last Christmas. $60 I didn't really have because I wanted her to feel like family, like a daughter. And there she was, wearing it to tell me I wasn't one. Look, she said, low, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than the cruelty. I know this stings, but tonight matters. For us, for our future, for Daniel's connections. Everything has to be perfect. No awkward moments. And she paused. Do me a favor and don't go telling the neighbors about this either. People get the wrong idea. Then she picked up her clutch off my sofa, the sofa where I used to rock my son to sleep, and she walked past me toward the door like I was a coat rack. There's food in the fridge, she said over her shoulder. Don't wait up. We'll be late. Daniel already had his hand on the doorknob. Keys in the other. It's just this once. Mom, he said. There'll be other times. But I knew that was a lie the second it left his mouth. I've heard other times my whole life. Other times never comes. There'll be other times is just a nicer way of saying not you. Not now, not ever. But I don't want to watch your face while I say it. And then the door closed. I want you to understand what that sound is like. When it's your own house and your own child, and the door shuts, and the two people you dressed and fed and gave your whole life to are on the other side of it, driving off to spend your money in a room you're not allowed to enter. The house went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I could hear the clock on the wall. I could hear my own breathing, ragged, like I'd been running. I walked to the front window and pulled the curtain back an inch. I watched Daniel's car pull away from the curb, the taillights getting smaller and smaller down the street until they turned the corner and were gone. And I stood there in my apron, pin still tucked in my chest, in the dark and the quiet, in a house I'd paid for stitch by stitch over 40 years, 65 years old. And I had never in my life felt as small as I did in that hallway, holding onto a curtain, watching my own son drive away. That was the night everything I thought I knew about my family came apart at the seams. But it wasn't the night I broke. Standing at that window, something else was starting to move in me. Something quiet and cold and patient. I just didn't have a name for it yet. I don't know how long I stood at that window. Long enough that my feet went numb on the floor. Long enough that the streetlight outside clicked from steady to that faint flicker it does when a bulb's about to go. I finally let the curtain fall and I walked to the sofa and I sat down in the dark and I waited for the crying to come. It didn't come. That surprised me. 40 years. Whenever the hurt got too big, I cried. When Daniel's father walked out and left me with a 6-month-old and $40 in a coffee can, I cried in the bathroom so the baby wouldn't hear. When I lost the lease on my first little shop, I cried. When my knees got so bad I had to start sitting to sew, I cried about that too. About getting old, about the body giving out before the bills were paid. I'm a crier. I come from criers. But that night, sitting in the dark, my eyes stayed dry as bone, because something in me had gone still. Not calm, still. The way the air goes still right before the weather turns and the sky gets that strange color, and you know something's coming. I sat there, and instead of crying, I started, for the first time in years, to actually think, to look at the last few years straight on, without flinching, without making excuses for anybody. And once I started looking, I couldn't stop. The first thing that floated up was Daniel's birthday, 2 years back, his 36th. I'd baked him a red velvet cake, the same one I've made him since he was 6 years old, cream cheese frosting, his name piped on top in my shaky hand. I got up before dawn to do it right. I drove it across town on the passenger seat, one hand steadying the box at every stop sign. And when I knocked on their door, Vanessa opened it in a cocktail dress, looked at the cake box in my arms, and said, "Oh, Maggie, you didn't have to do that. We already got a cake from the French bakery downtown." Something a little more, and she searched for the word. Sophisticated. Then she stood in the doorway. She didn't let me in. Said it was just close friends tonight. Nothing family. "We'll do something with you another time." She took my cake right out of my hands so she wouldn't have to look at me holding it, and shut the door. I sat in my car in their driveway for a minute before I could drive. I remember watching the light in their front window, hearing the music start up, the laughter, and there was my cake somewhere in that house, on a counter, in a bin I never did find out. I drove home with an empty passenger seat, and I told myself it was a misunderstanding. Daniel had told me to come at 7. When I asked him about it days later, he said, "Oh, that was a last-minute thing with some business people. Wasn't a big deal. Mom, don't make it a big deal." So I didn't. I made it small. I made everything small back then. Every slight, I folded it up neat and tucked it away, because a good mother understands. A good mother doesn't make it a big deal. Then Mother's Day came up in my mind. Last year, Daniel had promised he'd take me to lunch. Just the two of us. I put on my navy dress. I did my hair. I put on a little lipstick, and I sat in that same living room from 11 in the morning, waiting. 11 turned into 1. 1 turned into 3. I told myself he'd been held up. I told myself traffic. I told myself a dozen kind stories. The way you do when you're a mother, and the alternative is admitting your child forgot you. The phone finally rang at 7 that night, and his voice was bright, too bright. And he said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. Something came up with Vanessa's parents. We had to do brunch with them. You know how her family is about tradition." And I said, "Daniel, it's Mother's Day." And he said, I know. I'll make it up to you next week." He never made it up to me, and I never brought it up again, because good mothers don't keep score. Except I did keep score. That's the thing nobody knew about me. I'm a seamstress. My whole life is measurements. I keep a book. I got up off that sofa, and I went into my bedroom, and I opened the drawer of my nightstand, and I took out the little notebook I've kept for years. Not a diary. I'm not a diary kind of woman. It's an account book. Green cover, soft at the corners. And in it, in my own handwriting, in pencil so I could pretend I might erase it, was every dollar I'd ever handed my son. 2,000 for the down payment on his car. He said he'd pay it back by autumn. Which autumn, he never said. 1,500 when he was short on his mortgage the winter Vanessa wanted the kitchen redone. 1,000 for their anniversary trip to wherever it was, because Daniel called me nearly in tears saying they'd lose the deposit. 500 here, 300 there. Little ones I'd stopped writing down because I felt guilty writing them down, as if keeping track meant I didn't love him enough. And then at the bottom, the newest line, 3,000, which I now understood, sitting on the edge of my bed with the lamp on, had paid for a dinner I wasn't allowed to attend. I added it up. I hadn't added it up in a long time, on purpose, because some numbers you don't want to know. $9,000, give or take. $9,000 I'd handed over out of a seamstress's income, dollar by dollar, seam by seam, and not 1 cent of it had ever come back. And it had never once occurred to me to expect it back, because mothers give. That's the deal I signed up for. Mothers give and they don't ask. And if you ask, well then, what kind of mother are you? But sitting there, I finally asked the question I'd never let myself ask. What had I gotten? Not money. I never cared about money like that. What had I gotten in love, in respect, in a seat at the table? And the answer was leftovers. There's food in the fridge, don't wait up. That was my portion. That's what 40 years bought me. Leftovers, eaten alone, in the dark. I picked up my phone. I opened up the app that shows you what everybody's doing. And I scrolled, and there they were. Daniel and Vanessa at a beach house I'd never heard of. Daniel and Vanessa at some rooftop bar, glasses up, laughing. A dinner for Vanessa's birthday 3 weeks ago. A whole long table of people. And I hadn't even known it was her birthday. I used to bake her a cake too. This year, nobody told me she'd gotten a year older. And in none of it, not one single picture, going back years, was there a woman who looked like me. It was as if they'd taken a photograph of their life and carefully, patiently, cut me out of it with a little pair of scissors, the kind I use for thread. Snip, snip, until there was just a clean, empty space where the mother used to be. I set the phone face down on the quilt, and that's when I felt it. Not the crying. Something underneath the crying. Something that had been sitting down there so long, I'd forgotten it could stand up. It wasn't the loud kind of anger, the kind that throws a plate. I've never been that. It was the cold kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't shout because it's too busy remembering, the kind that lines up every snip of those scissors, every other time, every misunderstanding, every I'll make it up to you, and finally sees the pattern in the fabric. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. You know exactly how the whole thing was cut. Here's what I understood. Sitting on my bed at 2 a.m. They hadn't cut me out all at once. There was never one big fight, one clean break I could point to. They did it slowly. A missed lunch here, a last-minute change there, a cake taken at the door, a dinner I paid for and wasn't invited to, little threads pulled out one at a time, so gently I never felt the garment coming apart until I looked down and there was nothing left but loose ends. And the worst part, the part that made the cold thing in my chest go colder, was that I had helped them do it. I'd handed them the scissors. Every time I said it's fine, every time I said I understand, every time I made myself small so they wouldn't have to feel bad, I'd handed them the scissors and I'd held still. Not anymore. I didn't have a plan yet. I want to be honest about that. I didn't lie down that night with some grand scheme worked out. I lay down with something simpler and harder, and it kept me staring at the ceiling until the sky started going gray at the edges. I lay down knowing that the woman who put up with everything, the woman who ate her supper alone and called it love, that woman was done. Whatever came next, she wasn't going to be the one to meet it. I just didn't know yet how soon next was coming. Because at 7:30, the very next morning, there was going to be a knock at my door. And nothing was going to be the same after I answered it. The knock came at 7:30 sharp, and I want to tell you, I answered it like the new woman I'd promised myself I'd be the night before. I didn't. I answered it in my robe with yesterday's resolve already gone soft, because that's how it really goes. You decide to change your life at 2 a.m, and then the sun comes up, and you're just a tired old woman shuffling to the door, wondering who on earth is knocking before you've even had your coffee. There was a man on my porch in a cheap gray blazer holding a clipboard. Behind him, a car I didn't recognize idled at the curb. "Margaret Cole," he said. It wasn't really a question. I said yes, and he held out an envelope and a pen and asked me to sign that I'd received it. I signed. 40 years of signing for fabric deliveries. My hand does it before my brain catches up. He tore off the pink copy, said, "Have a good one, ma'am," in a voice that meant the opposite, and he was back in his car before I'd even read my own name on the front. It was thick. Certified. The return address was a bank, and under the bank's name were 2 words I'd spent my whole life avoiding. Final notice. I made my coffee first. I want you to know that. Whatever was in that envelope had waited 2 years to find me. It could wait until I had something hot in my hands. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd hemmed 1,000 dresses and helped my son with homework. I only half understood, and I slit the envelope open with a butter knife, and I read it. I read it 3 times before the words would hold still. It was a demand for payment. A business loan, originated a little over 2 years back. The borrower of record was a company I'd never heard the full name of, Vanessa's Boutique, dressed up in official-sounding letters. And the loan was in default, 90 days past due. And here was the part that made the coffee turn to acid in my stomach. There was a guarantor on that loan, a cosigner, a second name the bank could come after when the first name stopped paying. My name, Margaret A. Cole, right there in the guarantor line, in a font that made it look official, as if it were something I'd meant to do. And the number next to all of it was $62,000. I sat very still. I remember the refrigerator humming again, that same hum from the night before, as if the house had a heartbeat, and it was the only thing in the room keeping time while my own heart forgot how. $62,000. I don't make that in 2 years of good work. I have never in my life held a fraction of that at one time. And the bank was telling me, in 3 cold paragraphs, that I owed it. Me, the seamstress. The embarrassment. The woman who wasn't good enough for the restaurant her own name was quietly paying for. And then the memory came. It came the way a splinter comes. The kind you forgot was even in there until you press the right spot and the whole thing flares up. 2 years ago, it was a Sunday. Daniel came by the house, and it was rare enough for him to come by that I'd been thrilled. I'd made lunch. I remember I made lunch. And after we ate, he got kind of fidgety, and he pulled some papers out of a folder, and he set them on this exact table. And he had a pen ready. He already had the pen out, and he said, "Mom, I need a favor. It's nothing. It's just a formality. The bank's doing this loan for Vanessa's shop, and they want a second signature on the paperwork. Somebody with property, somebody established. It's just how they do it. It's a technicality. You won't have to do anything. You'll never even hear about it again. Somebody with property." That's what I was good for that day. I signed. Heaven help me, I signed. I didn't read it. Who reads it? Your son sitting across from you with his hand on the paper telling you it's nothing. It's a formality and you love him. And you want to be useful. You want to matter. You want to be the kind of mother whose signature means something. So you sign where the little arrow points and you feel proud for about 10 minutes that your boy needed you for something. I signed away my house and my shop and my whole life's work as collateral, and I felt proud about it. That's the part I have to live with. You'll never even hear about it again. He'd looked me right in the eye and said that. And for 2 years it was true. Because for 2 years somebody was making the payments, and the machine stayed quiet. But now the machine had stopped being fed, and it had woken up, and it had come looking for the second name on the paper. The name with a paid-off house behind it. Mine. I'm going to be honest with you about the first thing I felt, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve me pretending I was brave. The first thing I felt wasn't anger. It was the old reflex. Fix it. Protect him. My hand actually went for the phone to call Daniel and say, "Honey, what happened? Are you in trouble? How do we take care of this?" We, as if it were ours to carry, as if his mess were my job. 40 years of that reflex. It runs deep. And then the cold thing from the night before woke up too. And it caught my hand before I picked up that phone. And it said, "No, not this time. This time you find out what's real before you pick up a single thing to carry." So I didn't call my son. I did something I had never once done in my life. I made an appointment with a lawyer. Now, I don't know lawyers. People like me don't have a lawyer. We have a fellow who does the taxes once a year, and that's the whole legal team. But I did know one person, Ruth Alvarez. Ruth had been coming into my shop for going on 15 years. I let out the seams of her maternity dresses when she was carrying both her children. I took in her suits when she made partner and lost 20 pounds from the stress of it. I hemmed her mother's funeral dress in one afternoon, no charge, and she never forgot it. Ruth was a real lawyer, a sharp one, the kind who reads the fine print for a living. And she'd sat in my shop 100 times telling me about her cases while I pinned her hems. I always figured that was just chatter between a customer and her seamstress. Turned out it was the most useful friendship I had. I called her office that Monday. I said, Ruth, it's Maggie Cole from the alterations shop, and I need help, and I don't know if I can afford you. And that woman said, Maggie, you hemmed my mother's dress the day before we buried her. Come in tomorrow. We'll figure out the money later, or we won't. Just come in. I sat across from her the next morning with that certified letter in my handbag, and I slid it across her desk, and I watched her read it the way I'd watched her read 100 menus and magazines in my shop, except this time her face changed. She read it slowly. She flipped it over. She asked me a couple of quiet questions. Did you know you were a guarantor? Did you read what you signed? Do you have a copy of the original documents? No, no, and no. Ruth put the letter down and she took her glasses off, and she looked at me with a kind of gentleness that scared me worse than anything, because Ruth is not a gentlewoman by trade. Maggie, she said, I need to pull the full loan file before I say anything for certain, but I want you to prepare yourself, because a guarantor is not a technicality. A guarantor is the person the bank turns to when the borrower can't pay. Legally, right now on paper, this debt is as much yours as it is theirs. Maybe more, because you're the one with something they can actually take. Something they can actually take. My house, my shop, the two things 40 years of needlework had bought me, free and clear mine, the only things in this world that were only ever mine. Pull the file. I told her, pull all of it. I want to see every page. I want to know exactly what my son signed my name next to. Ruth wrote something on a pad. Then she looked up at me, and she said the thing that turned the whole story. She said, Maggie, when I pull this, I might find things you don't want to know about how deep this goes, about where the money went. Are you sure you want the whole picture, and not just the piece that lets you sleep at night? And the old Maggie, the one who ate her supper in the dark and called it love, that Maggie would have said, just tell me what I have to pay and let's keep it quiet. But I wasn't her anymore. I want the whole picture, I said. Every thread of it, even the parts that hurt, especially those. Ruth nodded slowly, as if she'd been hoping I'd say exactly that. Then give me a week, she said. And Maggie, do me one favor. Don't tell your son you've been here. Not yet. Let me see what's really going on before he has a chance to explain it away. Don't tell to your son. Sitting there, I realized that was the first piece of advice anyone had given me in years that was actually for me. Not for Daniel. Not for keeping the peace. For me. I walked out of that office into the ordinary morning, cars going by, a man hosing down the pavement in front of his deli, the whole world acting like it was just another Tuesday. And it was, for everybody but me. For me, it was the first morning in years that I wasn't carrying somebody else's weight up front and pretending it was light. I was carrying something heavier now, but it was mine. And there's a strange kind of strength in that, in a burden you chose to pick up with your eyes open, instead of one that got tied to your back while you were being told it was nothing, just a formality. You'll never even hear about it again. A week, Ruth said. A week to find out how deep the hole went and whose hands had really dug it. It turned out to be deeper than either of us guessed. That week was the longest of my life, and I filled it the only way I know how. I worked. I had a wedding party's worth of bridesmaid dresses due, 6 of them, pale lavender things the bride had picked out, and I sat at my machine from morning till the light went and I sewed. People think sewing is delicate work, and it is, but it's also the best thinking a person can do, because your hands are busy, and your mouth is shut and your mind goes wherever it needs to go. My mind went in circles around one question all week. Where did $62,000 go? Because here's what didn't add up, even for me, and I'm no businesswoman. Vanessa's boutique was small, a pretty little storefront in the nice part of town, a rack of dresses, some candles and jewelry by the register, the kind of place that sells $400 blouses to women who don't ask the price. A shop like that doesn't need $62,000 in one loan. I'd know. I've run a shop for 4 decades on a fraction of that. You buy a good machine, you stock your materials, you make the rent you pay yourself last. So where did it go? I couldn't wait a whole week just sewing and wondering. So a few nights in, I did some looking of my own. I still had a shoebox of things Daniel had left at my house over the years. And in the bottom of it were a couple of bank envelopes he'd asked me to hold once and never asked for back. I sat on my bedroom floor at midnight with that shoebox and my reading glasses, and I went through every scrap of it. I didn't understand half the numbers, but I understood enough to see money going out to places that had nothing to do with dresses, and I circled them in pencil, the same pencil I keep my accounts in, and I put them aside for Ruth. My knees ached from sitting on that floor, and I didn't care. For the first time, I wasn't waiting to be told. I was finding out. Ruth called me on the Thursday, 6 days in, and asked me to come to her office, and I could tell by her voice she'd found it. Lawyers have a voice they use when the news is bad and they're deciding how much of it to give you at once. Ruth used that voice. She had the full file spread across her desk like a surgeon's tray. "Maggie," she said, "sit down." And then she walked me through it, page by page, in language plain enough for a seamstress, because that's the kind of woman Ruth is. The loan wasn't just for the shop. The shop was the story they told the bank, and my name was the collateral that made the story believable. But once the money came through, it didn't all go into candles and dress racks. Some of it did, enough to keep up appearances. The rest of it, Ruth showed me, bled out in 100 directions over 2 years. A luxury car lease, a holiday, the beach house from the photographs, payments to other credit cards, the kind of thing you do when you're robbing one hole to fill another. A regular monthly draw that just went. Restaurants, clothes, a whole life 2 sizes too big for the income underneath it, held up by borrowed money. And when the borrowed money ran out, propped up by more borrowed money. And when that ran out too, propped up by me, by my house, by my name in the guarantor line. They weren't investing, Maggie, Ruth said, taking off her glasses. They were drowning, and they used you as a life raft, quietly so you'd never notice, right up until the raft was the only thing left keeping them above water. I sat with that, and then I asked the question I'd been circling all week, the one with a knife in it. The 3,000, I said, 3 months ago. For a dinner. Was that part of this too? Ruth didn't have that answer. It wasn't in the loan file. But I found it myself. 2 days later, and I found it the way I've found everything true in my life. With my hands. Because here's a thing about being invisible. When you're the help, people forget you're in the room. And Daniel, even now, even in the middle of drowning, was still my son, and he still did what he'd done his whole life when a seam split or a button popped. He dropped his good clothes at my shop for me to mend. He didn't do it to see me. He did it because I'm free and I'm good and old habits die hard. That week he'd left a suit jacket on my counter, navy nice fabric, with a note in Vanessa's handwriting. Elbows torn, need it Friday. Which is how she talks to me even secondhand, as if I'm a service and not a person. And I did what I've done to every jacket that's ever crossed my counter for 40 years. The thing every real tailor does before they touch a needle. I checked the pockets. You always check the pockets. You'd be amazed what people leave in there. Receipts, cinema stub, once a diamond earring, once a folded up divorce petition. Honest to goodness. You check the pockets so you don't sew a man's shopping list into his lining forever. In the inside breast pocket of my son's torn jacket, folded in quarters, soft from sitting there a while, was a receipt from the steakhouse. That steakhouse. The dinner I wasn't good enough for. The date matched. And the total at the bottom. The total for the dinner I had paid $3,000 toward. The dinner I'd been left home from so I wouldn't embarrass anybody. Was over $1,100 for one night. Wine. Steaks. A bottle of something with a French name I couldn't pronounce. $1,100 in one evening, out of money I'd handed over dollar by dollar, while I sat alone in my house eating leftovers out of a container in the dark. But that's not what stopped my heart. Behind the receipt, tucked in the same pocket, was a business card. It wasn't for a restaurant or a caterer. It was for a lawyer, a family law attorney. And on the back, in Vanessa's same tidy handwriting, was a date and a time, an appointment. Recent. Coming up. I stood at my counter holding my son's jacket, and I understood two things at once. Vanessa was seeing a divorce lawyer, and Daniel didn't know. I called Ruth. I didn't even say hello. Family law, I said. Vanessa's got an appointment with a divorce attorney, and I don't think my son has any idea. And Ruth was quiet for a second, and then she said, in that careful voice, Maggie, do you understand what that means? In the middle of all this debt. And I said, no, tell me. And she said, it means she's getting ready to run. She's going to file, and she's going to try to walk away clean, and she's going to leave every dollar of that debt, your debt, sitting on Daniel and on you. She's cutting the raft loose, Maggie. She's going to let the two of you sink and swim to shore by herself. I put the jacket down. I want to tell you I felt vindicated. I didn't. I felt sick. Because whatever Daniel had done to me, and he'd done plenty, he was about to have it done to him. And there's no mother alive who watches that coming and feels nothing. And that's when the last piece walked into my shop, on her own 2 feet. 3 days later. I heard the bell over the door and I looked up, and there was a woman I didn't know, maybe 70, dressed expensive but plain, the way people with real money dress when they've got nothing to prove. She stood in the doorway of my little shop, looking at the racks, the machine, the pincushion on my wrist, taking the measure of me. And she said, "Are you Margaret Cole, Daniel's mother?" And I said, "I am." And she said, "My name is Loretta. I'm Vanessa's mother. And I think you and I need to talk because I know what my daughter is doing, and I can't stay quiet about it anymore." I turned the sign on the door to closed. I made us both coffee in the back, in the little kitchen where I eat my lunch, and Loretta sat down across from me in a folding chair as if it were a throne. And she told me the truth, all of it, the parts even Ruth couldn't find in a file. She told me her daughter hadn't come from money. That surprised me. Vanessa carried herself as if she'd been born into it. But Loretta said no, they'd been ordinary people. They'd scraped. And somewhere along the way, Vanessa had decided that ordinary was a kind of shame, a thing to be hidden and outrun and never ever admitted to. That's why she is the way she is, Loretta said. Not because she's better than you, Maggie. Because underneath it, she's terrified somebody's going to find out she's exactly like you. A woman who came from nothing. So she has to make sure everybody knows she's not you, over and over out loud. Your son married a woman who spent her whole life running from the mirror. And you, she paused, you're the mirror. You're the mirror. I've thought about that 100 times since. And then Loretta told me the part I already half knew, that Vanessa was going to file, that she'd been planning it for months, that she intended to leave Daniel holding all of it, the debt, the shame, the wreckage, and land herself somewhere soft while the two of us went down. And Loretta said, I raised her, so this is partly on me, and I can't give her a conscience she never grew. But I could come here and give you a warning. So here it is. Protect yourself, Margaret. Not my daughter, not even your son, if it comes to it. You. Because nobody in this whole story has ever once done that, and it's about time somebody did. I asked her the question I'd asked Ruth. Why are you telling me this? What do you get out of it? And Loretta looked at me with tired eyes and she said nothing. I get to lose my daughter a little more than I already have. But I'm 70 years old, and I've watched what chasing money and appearances did to my girl. And I've decided I'd rather do one decent thing at the end than keep quiet and stay comfortable. Money without dignity isn't worth the paper it's printed on. I learned that too late to teach it to her. Maybe I can just live it, here today, by warning you. That's the whole reason I came. She finished her coffee. She stood up. At the door, she turned around and she said one last thing. When this breaks, and it's going to break soon, my daughter is going to walk away and land on her feet. She always does. But your son, he's going to hit the ground. And you're the only person left who gets to decide whether you're there when he does. I can't tell you what to do about that. I just didn't want you deciding it blind. Then the bell rang over the door, and she was gone. And I was standing alone in my closed shop with a cold cup of coffee and everything I needed, finally, to do what came next. I had the loan file. I had the receipt. I had the divorce lawyer's card. I had the truth from the one person who had no reason to lie to me. I had every thread of it in my two hands. Now I just had to decide how to cut. I planned it the way I plan a hard alteration. You don't just start cutting. You measure. You pin. You lay the whole thing out flat and you look at it from every side before the scissors ever touch the cloth, because a bad cut can't be undone. So I sat with Ruth twice more that week, and we laid it all out flat. Here's what Ruth explained to me, and I need you to understand it, because this is the part where a lot of people get it wrong. Being lied to didn't erase the debt. I kept waiting for her to tell me that since Daniel had tricked me, I was off the hook, the way it happens in films. She never told me that, because it isn't true. I signed that guarantor line, fair and square, in the eyes of the law, no matter what my son whispered while he did it. The bank didn't care that I'd been deceived. They cared that there was a paid-off house behind my name, and they were coming for it. So we couldn't make the debt disappear. What we could do, Ruth said, was decide who actually paid it. And that was a different fight, a winnable one, because the bank didn't want my house. Banks don't want houses. They want money. Houses are just a headache they take when they can't get money. If we could put together a real plan, real dollars coming from the people who'd actually spent them, the bank would take the deal every time over dragging an old seamstress through a foreclosure that'd make the local paper. The dollars had to come from Daniel and Vanessa. From the car, the lease they could break. From the boutique's inventory and its good equipment, which could be sold. From every soft, expensive thing they'd bought with borrowed money, turned back into the cash that borrowed money used to be. It wouldn't cover all 62,000 at once, but it would cover enough and structure the rest into payments the bank would accept, that Ruth could get me released from the personal guarantee. My house and my shop carved out and protected, safe mine. But only if I moved before Vanessa filed. Once she filed for divorce, everything froze, lawyers on all sides, assets locked up in a fight that would take a year and bleed everybody dry. The window was maybe 2 weeks, and the leverage, the one thing that would make both of them sit down and sign fast instead of running, was that I knew. I knew about the divorce lawyer before Daniel did. I knew where the money went. I had the file, the receipt, the card, all of it. Vanessa's whole plan depended on nobody seeing it coming. I'd already seen it. So I picked the place. And I'll admit there was a part of me, a small unkind part I'm not ashamed of, that picked it on purpose. I had Ruth's office send them each a message asking them to meet me for dinner, family business, and I chose that steakhouse, the one I wasn't good enough for, the one they left me home from. I made a reservation under my own name, Margaret Cole, party of 3, and I wore my navy dress, the one I saved for weddings and funerals. And I got there first. And when Vanessa walked in and saw me already sitting at the table, in that room, at that restaurant, in my navy dress, with a folder squared up on the white tablecloth in front of me, her whole face did the thing you saw at the very start. The lipstick smile froze and then fell right off her face. Daniel came in behind her and stopped like he'd walked into a wall. We don't bring people like you to places like that, Maggie. That's what she'd told me 3 months before. So I let her stand there a second, in the doorway of the place I supposedly couldn't handle. And then I said it, calm as anything. Sit down, both of you. You wanted me to stay home so I wouldn't embarrass anybody. Fine. But now you're going to sit here, and you're going to look at what I found. They sat. My son couldn't lift his eyes off the folder. Vanessa's wine glass, which the waiter had barely set down, stopped halfway to her mouth. And my hands, for the first time in years, weren't shaking. I opened the folder. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't have to. I've learned that the loudest thing in any room is a quiet woman with proof. I started with the loan. I laid the certified letter on the table facing them. $62,000. My name in the guarantor line. Daniel, I said, you told me it was a formality. You said I'd never hear about it again. I heard about it. I laid down the bank's breakdown next. The car, the trips, the beach house, the monthly draw that just vanished. This is where it went, I said. Not into candles and dress racks. Into a life you couldn't afford, that you made me the collateral for. Vanessa opened her mouth, and I put down the third piece before she got a word out. The steakhouse receipt. Right here on this table, I said, in this restaurant. $1,100. From the night you told me I wasn't good enough to sit in this room. I paid for that night, Vanessa. I sat at home in the dark and I paid for your wine. And then because I'd measured twice and I only had to cut once, I laid down the last piece, the divorce lawyer's card, her handwriting on the back, the date, the time. And I watched my son's face while I did it, because he was the one who didn't know. I watched Daniel look at that card and not understand it for a second, and then understand it all at once. And I watched something in him just cave in. Vanessa, he said, and his voice cracked on her name. Vanessa, what is this? She didn't even flinch. I'll give her that. The woman had ice in her. But she was cornered and she knew it, and cornered people show you who they are. She sat back and she looked at me, and the honey was gone out of her voice, and she said, so what? So what if I was getting out? You think I was going to go down with him for this? For his mess? She turned on Daniel then, right there at the table. Your mother's right about one thing. It went to a life we couldn't afford, and whose idea was every bit of that, Daniel. Who wanted the car? Who wanted the house? And now you want me to stand here and burn for it. It was ugly, but it was the truth finally coming out of the both of them, and I let it. I didn't say a word. Sometimes you just get out of the way and let the seam they sewed themselves come apart on its own. When they'd run out of it, when they were both just sitting there breathing hard, I said my piece. And here's what I want you to understand, because this is the whole story right here. I'm not going to lose my house, I said. Not for either of you. That house and that shop are 40 years of my life, and I paid for them with my own 2 hands, every stitch, and no one is taking them from me. So here's what's going to happen. Ruth Alvarez, my attorney, is going to send you both a proposal. You're going to sell the car. You're going to sell the boutique's equipment and its stock. You're going to turn every borrowed thing you own back into money and put it against this debt. And you're going to sign a plan for the rest. And I am going to be released from that guarantee in writing before your wife files a single piece of paper. And if you fight me on it, if either of you tries to run or drag it out, then everything in this folder goes to the bank and to Vanessa's new lawyer both, and you can explain all of it under oath. Vanessa stood up. Her chair scraped loud enough that the next table looked over. She grabbed her clutch, and she looked at me, and I saw it, just for a second. Before she covered it up, she saw herself in me. The woman who came from nothing, the mirror. She hated me for it more in that second than she ever had. And then she walked out of that restaurant and out of my son's life. And as far as I know, she landed on her feet somewhere soft, exactly like her mother said she would. I never saw her again, which left me and my son at a table for three, with one empty chair. Daniel didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at the folder, at the wreck of his life spread out on white linen. And then he put his face in his hands, and his shoulders started going. And my 38-year-old son cried at that table like the little boy who used to fall asleep on my sofa while I sewed. And every part of me wanted to reach across and gather him up the way I did when he was small. That reflex, it never dies. It's the deepest stitch there is. But I sat still. Finally, he looked up at me, eyes red, wrecked, and he asked me the question. The one I'd known was coming since the night the door closed. Mom, he said, do you forgive me? And I want to tell you what I told him, because it's the truest thing I know. I said, Daniel, I'm always going to love you. That was never the question. But love and forgiveness aren't the same thing, and you don't get to skip from the mess you made straight to me making it feel better, because that's what we've always done, and look where it got us. Forgiveness is real. It's coming, but you're going to walk to it, not get carried. You're going to pay what you owe. You're going to sell the things and sign the papers and take the job and do the years. And you're going to show me, not tell me, that you're somebody different than the man who sat in a car and drove off while his mother watched from a window. Do that, and forgiveness will be waiting at the end of it. But I'm done handing it out for free. I handed everything out for free for 40 years. That shop is closed. He nodded. He didn't argue. For the first time in years, he didn't try to talk his way sideways out of it. He just nodded, and he wiped his face with the back of his hand like a child. And he said, okay, Mom, okay, I'll walk. And that sitting in the restaurant I wasn't good enough for, in my navy dress with my son finally listening, was the moment I stopped being invisible. The papers took about 6 weeks to sign all of them. Ruth handled the bank the way I handle a wedding gown, patient, precise, no sudden moves. And in the end, it went exactly as she said it would. The car went back. The boutique got stripped down to the bones and sold off. Daniel turned every borrowed thing that life had been built on back into money, and it covered enough that the bank took the deal on the rest. And one Tuesday morning, Ruth called me and said, Maggie, it's done. You're released. In writing. Your house and your shop are yours, and no one can ever touch them for this again. I sat down in my kitchen chair when she said it. 40 years I'd owned that house, and I'd never once felt like it could be taken. Turned out I'd spent 2 years not knowing it nearly was. And now it was mine again, clean, and I cried right there at the table. And this time I let myself. There was one piece of the settlement I want to tell you about, because it's the part that still makes me shake my head. When they sold off the boutique's equipment, part of the deal, the way these things get carved up, was that some of it came to me, credited against what Daniel still owed. And so one afternoon, a lorry pulled up to my little shop and 2 men carried in a commercial sewing machine. A good one. Better than anything I'd ever been able to afford in my life. An industrial embroidery unit, too, and a cutting table, professional grade. Vanessa bought it all with borrowed money to play at being a designer, and it had mostly sat in that pretty shop looking expensive. And now it sat in my shop, in the back, next to my old machine that I'd run for 22 years and patched together with spare parts and prayer. Think about that. The very equipment that got bought to hold up the life that nearly cost me everything ended up in my hands, running honest work. I stood there the day they installed it, and I ran a test seam on that big, beautiful machine, and it purred like a cat, and I laughed out loud in my empty shop. Because there is a kind of justice in the world, sometimes, but it doesn't come the way you think. It doesn't come as a stranger with a check. It comes as a sewing machine on the back of a lorry, earned, not given. I did something else with it, too. I'd been turning work away for years because I couldn't keep up. My hands aren't what they were. My eyes need the light stronger every season. So I put a card up at the community college. Wanted apprentice. Must be willing to learn it right. And I hired a girl named Priya, 19, quick hands, hungry to learn a real trade in a world that keeps telling young people trades are beneath them. She reminds me of myself at that age, before life sanded the hope off. I'm teaching her everything. The big machine's mostly hers now. Cole's Alterations has 2 chairs at the window these days. And some afternoons I catch myself just watching her work, and I feel something I hadn't felt in longer than I can say. I feel like the 40 years meant something, like they get to keep going in somebody's hands after mine finally quit. Daniel comes on Sundays, every Sunday, no exceptions, which is more than he managed in the good years. He's not the same man. He lost the shine, and honestly, he's better for it. He's got a regular job now, an office thing at a supply company, nothing glamorous. And he drives a used sedan with a dent in the door. And he brings me coffee and those cheap petrol station donuts I actually prefer to the fancy ones. And we sit and we talk. Real talk. He's making his payments to the plan every month on time, and he sends me a copy of each one, not because I asked him to, but because he understands now that I don't take his word for things anymore. I take the receipt. He earned that the hard way. Words are free. I've learned to trust the ones that come with proof behind them. Is it fixed? No. I don't know that it ever fully fixes. There's a scar there, and scars don't disappear. They just stop hurting when you press on them. But he's walking toward me, like I told him to, one honest Sunday at a time, and I can see him getting closer. Forgiveness, the real kind, the kind you walk to instead of get carried to. It's close now. Some Sundays, I think it's already quietly arrived, and neither of us has said so out loud yet. And me, you want to know about me, since this whole thing turned out to be my story and not his. I bought myself something. This is going to sound like nothing to you, but I need you to understand what it meant. In 40 years of sewing for other people, in 40 years of making other women beautiful for their weddings and their parties and their good nights out, I had never once made something for myself. Not one thing. So this spring I bought good fabric, real fabric, the kind I'd only ever cut for paying customers. Deep blue, the color of the sky right before the stars come out. And I made myself a dress, measured for my own body, my 65-year-old body, wide where it's wide and soft where it's soft. And I made it fit me perfectly, because if there's one woman on this earth I know how to fit, it's me. And I wore it to dinner with Doris. My neighbor, my real friend, the one who checked on me the whole way through. And we split a bottle of wine and a piece of cake, and we laughed until we cried. And I did not sit alone in the dark. And nobody told me I wasn't good enough to be there. I go places now. Doris and I took the train to the coast last month, and I put my bare feet in the ocean for the first time since I was a young woman. And I stood there in the cold water with my dress bunched up in my fists like a girl. And I thought, all those years I told myself sacrifice was love. That being a good mother meant giving until there was nothing left of me. And I had it wrong. I had it wrong the whole time. So let me tell you what I finally learned, and then I'll let you go. Your sacrifice is real, and it matters. But it was never supposed to cost you yourself. Love that makes you small isn't love. It's just something wearing love's coat. And the people who are meant to be at your table will never once make you beg for a chair. If somebody makes you feel invisible, you are allowed to be seen. If somebody makes you feel like an embarrassment, the embarrassment was never yours to carry. You are allowed to set the folder on the table. You are allowed to say enough. Nobody, not your child, not anybody, can take your dignity from you. They can only take it if you hand it over. And I'm not handing mine over anymore. Neither should you. Take care of yourselves out there.